Howdy, y'all. So today we're going to do a quick run through of Reconstruction, kind of hitting the major highlights. So first, we have the end of the American Civil War, and this brings about the need for Reconstruction. A little bit of Reconstruction under Lincoln's plan had been started during the last year or two of the Civil War for some of the occupied states, but Reconstruction, as we will understand it, doesn't really start until the end of the Civil War. So here's Confederate troops surrendering to the Union Army, surrendering weapons, battle flags, all that kinds of stuff. You understand this was a brutal, bloody war. It took a physical toll on the death and destruction, it took a psychological toll, seeing the hardships of what both civilians and particularly soldiers experienced. You're going to have PTSD across whole regions of this nation. So it's not just like some people in a population, you'll have whole populations that are suffering from this trauma. In particular, soldiers don't really have any support for this because PTSD isn't even a diagnosed situation yet. On top of that, you have the other physical component, which is just the sheer number of dead. You have to find new cemeteries, new places to put all these dead. You can't just leave them out because that'll lead to disease and dishonor and all this kind of stuff. So we have hundreds of new cemeteries all across the nation popping up, and then the big ones like the Gettysburg Cemetery and Arlington National Cemetery are used to house U.S. soldiers. Now you have these veterans, so these guys that just ended the war trying to figure out, well, what the heck are we going to do now? The war is over. How do we rebuild? How do we go about putting this nation back together? So there's three major questions facing the nation. First, what do we do with these ex-Confederates? So particularly the high-ranking ones like Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and Robert E. Lee, the primary general of the Confederacy. Then you also have the million or so other soldiers who fought for the Confederacy. What do we do with them? What's going to be the outcome? How are we going to treat them? Then we have the states themselves who seceded from the United States and basically committed treason at a state level. How do we bring them back in? Are they going to be treated fairly? Are they going to have equal rights to the original or to the states that stayed in the Union? And then most importantly, what do we do with the 4 million former slaves? Are they going to become full citizens? Are they going to be some hybrid thing? Are they going to be forcibly deported? What do we do with them? What's their status in society going to be? We know they're going to be free because Lincoln had the 13th Amendment passed. But that lies one of the big problems. Lincoln. Everyone's looking to Lincoln to solve these problems and figure out what was the next step for the nation. We knew what his feelings were with the Emancipation Proclamation and then the amendment. But there was a problem. Lincoln was assassinated, so we never really get to see what might have actually happened if Lincoln had been president during the bulk of Reconstruction. Instead, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner, is going to take over Reconstruction. To give you an idea of Johnson's point of view, when he took over, he said, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." So you can see, although the former slaves, the African-American citizens, or not even citizens technically yet, the African-American persons in America, the black people, are given no respect by Andrew Johnson. They are basically seen as, okay, you've gotten your freedom, now I don't care. Now Johnson is an interesting case. He was raised in the South, he was dirt poor coming up, so he hated slavery, hated the slaves, but he also hated the white people who owned them. He hates the whole South, and he wants to see the South punished. He doesn't care about helping anybody in the South, slave, white, or otherwise. He just wants them punished, the whole Southern system. So Johnson's version of Reconstruction. So amnesty for all former Confederates who took an oath of loyalty to the United States. So this is basically anyone who is an average soldier, average citizen, as long as you signed your little sheet of paper, said your Pledge of Allegiance to the United States, you were good. If you were rich or higher ranking, you had to come to Johnson in Washington and beg for forgiveness in person to get an actual pardon. So like Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee would have to come beg in person. And this goes back to Johnson's childhood. He wants all these rich and powerful people that lorded it over him to now have to bend a knee and beg him for their rights and citizenship back. States just had to write a new constitution, any new constitution, and they came right back in. They did have to ratify the 13th Amendment and repudiate Confederate debt, meaning any Confederate debts that state had weren't going to be paid. So if you loaned money to the Confederacy for any reason or sold things to the Confederacy on credit, that money's just gone. And finally, blacks would not be allowed to vote or be citizens. So if you were a freedman, a former slave, you had your freedom, but that was it. And that is a fundamental problem that's going to crop up in this first stage of Reconstruction. As a result of African Americans not having any protections, you have what are called the Black Codes coming into effect, which basically we couldn't have slavery anymore. So we're going to create a system in the South that creates as close to slavery as we can get. So these Black Codes are laws that basically create a punishment system. If you break a certain law, you go to jail. But the problem was these were targeted at African Americans. So if a black person was a vagrant, that means if they didn't have a home, they could be arrested. Now, as a former slave, you probably didn't own land, you may not have had a home, so you have a vast portion of these former slaves getting arrested, and the punishment for being a vagrant was to go work on the plantation you just gained your freedom from. So you had a choice, either sign a contract with your old plantation owner, your former master, to stay there and not get arrested, and get paid virtually nothing, or you could try to leave and most likely get arrested and still get forced to work back on that same plantation. So it's a catch-22. There's no good way out. There's a whole lot of other laws, and basically all the laws basically said if a black person is doing something a white person doesn't want them to, they're going to get arrested, and their punishment for being arrested is basically slave labor. But they're saying, oh, they're not slaves, they're prisoners. And this creates a very bad precedent, because although we'll do away with the Black Codes fairly quickly, this is going to create a system in the United States of prisons being used as a way to subjugate minority populations. First, it targets African Americans primarily, then Mexican Americans as that population grows, and so on and so forth. So this is a fundamental problem that we are still struggling with today. And it's starting here. So we can take it all the way back to Jamestown with the creation of slavery, but this is a second evolution of kind of racial control, this effort at white supremacy, and basically racial slavery under a different name. So the governor of South Carolina said this: the general interest of both the white man and the Negroes requires that he be kept as near to the condition of slavery as possible. Basically, they're saying it's best for white people and black people if black people are slaves. But we can't have slavery anymore, so we got to get some system very close. That's the Black Codes. So not a very forward-thinking region. They lost the Civil War, but they're still trying to maintain their social order. Congress, not so thrilled with the way things are going in the South, particularly with the way Johnson's handling things. Because all these southern states wrote their constitutions very quickly without very much oversight, they start sending former Confederates who had received pardons to represent them in Congress the next year. And Congress was like, hell no. Y'all guys just fought a war against us. You sure as hell are not coming back to be in Congress. So they bar the doors, kick them out, and send them back to the South. So you start having this tug of war of power between Congress and the president, Andrew Johnson. And Congress goes further, and they create the Freedmen's Bureau. And they say, we're going to create an organization. It's led by Army officers, backed by the Army, but it's there to help civilians, to help the freedmen, the former slaves. And their job is to set up kind of negotiations between the former slaves and their former masters to negotiate contracts, because the slaves or the former slaves were at a disadvantage. These freedmen didn't know how to read and write, so signing contracts was difficult. So that was the primary job of the Freedmen's Bureau, was to negotiate contracts for housing, for labor, all this kinds of stuff. A secondary component was the Freedmen's Bureau schools, which was to educate primarily children, but African Americans of all ages attended these schools because they had been forbidden to learn how to read and write. Now they had this opportunity, they were going to take it. And a third kind of surprise action of the Freedmen's Bureau that they weren't planning on, but they became very integral in doing, which was African Americans would come to them asking for help to find their family members. So this was a big thing that was unintended, but it became a big component of the Freedmen's Bureau. So you have negotiate contracts and job treaties, you have schools, and then help find lost family members. So to give you an idea of one of these petitions to the Freedmen's Bureau, this is from Isabella Burton. So Horace Bucker sold my two sons, 7 and 5 years of age. Benjamin and Horace sold to Lark and Wright in Harrison County, Texas. Johnny Gilgarnett and Jeremiah Gilgarnett were playmates. I live in Houston now and was a widow and alone and would very much love to see them. So she's just basically saying, this is all the information I got. Maybe you can help. So they would write letters to other Freedmen's Bureau agencies, to other agents, and trying to say, okay, look, this lady is saying her sons might be in this area. Have you heard of them? And if so, they'll write letters to each other and help get these families put back together as best as they can. Even further than that, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which extends protections for civil rights for African Americans. So this is a first step in the direction of making African Americans full citizens, making these freedmen full citizens. So it passes both of these, both the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act, pass Congress. Johnson vetoes, and Congress overrides his veto. And Johnson is pissed at what Congress is doing. So this Reconstruction Act follows shortly after the first two. And this is an attempt to basically yank power away from Johnson. So the Reconstruction Act of 1876 declares there are no legal governments. So all those constitutions under Johnson that were created are null and void. No legal government existed in the South, throwing everything Johnson did out. It divided the South into 5 military districts, each under the command of a Union general, basically putting the South under military rule. So you can see the 5 military districts. Pay special attention to this for your map quiz. Basically, to be reconstructed, the law required that all southern states call new constitutional conventions, which all male eligible citizens could vote. So this meant black and white voters. Those states had to write new state constitutions guaranteeing black suffrage, so guaranteeing black men the right to vote. The state legislatures had to then approve both the 13th and the new 14th Amendment. So over the course of Reconstruction, we get the 13th Amendment setting slaves free, 14th Amendment granting citizenship, and then eventually we get the 15th Amendment, which gives voting rights to guarantee the right to vote. Now Congress isn't done there. They're tired of Johnson and what he's doing and all the stuff he's trying to veto and block. So they passed the Tenure of Office Act, which is basically a trap to get Johnson impeached. So the kind of simplified version is Edwin Stanton was Lincoln's Secretary of War. Johnson inherited Stanton when Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson took over for Lincoln. With this new Reconstruction Act, the military was in charge of Reconstruction. That means Stanton was the head of the military as the Secretary of War. So if Johnson can get his own Secretary of War in place, then he could control Reconstruction. So Johnson tries to fire Stanton. The problem was that new Tenure of Office Act said in order to fire a cabinet member, you had to have congressional approval. Now, this is new. It's never been like this before. But they did this because they knew Johnson wanted to fire Stanton. So when Johnson does try to do it, they basically can hold a trial of Johnson, an impeachment trial, to say, okay, You tried to break a law that we just passed, so you have broken a law, and therefore you are a criminal. We're going to try to impeach you and remove you from office. Now, this was a circus. They actually sold tickets to come watch his impeachment. This was, a kangaroo court. This wasn't a real trial in any real sense. They had an agenda the whole way through. And for a while, it looks very much like they're going to impeach Johnson. When it comes down to the final vote in Congress, they ultimately decide, comes down to about one vote, and they say, yeah, no, let's not do this. If we lay a trap, a legal trap, trap a president, and get him impeached, if we do that now, other Congresses can do it to other presidents in the future. So they decide, yeah, let's not do it. Johnson has his power basically removed. He's basically been neutered. So there's nothing left for him to do. He just has to sit there and be a lame duck president. Now, in the South, there is a new coalition supporting the Republican Party, so Lincoln's party, in the South to try to control Reconstruction. So you have black Republicans. So African Americans are going to vote Republican for a very long time. Now keep in mind, the Republicans at this point in time are the opposite of Republicans in modern day politics. So basically the Republicans of Lincoln's day are the Democrats of today. The parties switch ideologies kind of in the early 1900s. We'll talk about that next semester. Then you have carpetbaggers, which are Northerners who came south during Reconstruction. Then you have scalawags, who are Southerners who decide to help the Northerners, who help the Republican Party. Now, you do see some progress during this time. You see the first black senators and representatives going to Congress. You see the first African Americans participating in politics on the state and national level. So this is a big step forward. Just a decade earlier, many of these men were slaves. A decade later, they're holding some of the highest offices in the land. So there's this shining glimmer of hope, like, oh, okay, we got our crap together. The nation's back on track. Like we're going in, that all men are created equal, equal rights, all that kind of stuff that we put out in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Maybe we're living up to it. So you have this glimmer of hope. But the curtain's going to get drawn on that glimmer of hope very quickly. So we've done with the black codes. Black people have far more civil rights. At least on paper, it's looking very good. So you have the carpetbaggers, the scalawags. Well, the problem is you get the rise of things like the Klan. Now, the Klan's job, or the Klan's kind of goal, is very loose. It's basically like a terrorist cell group. None of the different Klan organizations really work together. They all had names like the Knights of the White Camellia, the Knights of the Rising Sun, all these kinds of things. And basically their job was to scare black people. They were pissed that they lost the war, so they were going to take it out on African Americans. Now, at the same time that the Klan is beginning to rise in prominence and it's getting more popular, Ulysses S. Grant takes over as president. And it's going to be during the same time period. So Grant's president, the Klan is rising up. You have a new group that's kind of using the Klan as a launching point for their own political ambitions, known as the Redeemers. So the Klan is kind of an informal terrorist organization, basically trying to scare black people to not vote. Then you have the Redeemers, who are the white Southerners that are slowly beginning to participate in politics again, trying to take back the South from the Republicans. So these Southern white Democratic Redeemers are trying to take the government back from the Republicans, from that black Republican coalition. So the significance of redemption. So slowly, redemption ends Reconstruction in the South. So as each state is redeemed, is brought back under democratic rule, that state is going to basically not be reconstructed anymore. The Republicans and Congress will lose power there. The North, over time, begins to lose interest. They spent 5 or 6 years fighting a war. They spent another decade with Reconstruction. By the time the Redeemers start taking back their states in the South, the North doesn't care. They're just done. The Southerners, these new Southern Redeemers, create what's called the spend nothing, do nothing mantra or slogan. Basically, many of their new state constitutions basically say, if it's going to cost money, we're not going to do it. period. So no taxes, and if you want government programs to help you, they cost money, you're not getting them. Then you have Custer's last stand, which is going to be one of the major final blows to Reconstruction. So Custer's last stand at the Little Bighorn. So after the Civil War, the United States Army was able to refocus some of their goals on fighting Native Americans, trying to push Native Americans off their land. Now, this is not a glorious part of American history. It's another one of these shameful periods. You know, we just fought a civil war to end slavery to kind of help course correct one shameful part of history, but that still has a long way to go. And now we're engaged in a whole nother kind of shameful part. Now, Custer is out far west in the Dakotas fighting against the Sioux, Native Americans, and he gets cocky, charges in headlong, and gets himself and about 200 of his men slaughtered. So he has about 250 men going up against between 3,000 to 5,000 Native Americans. So he did not plan this well. He and all his men get slaughtered. But the result for this regarding Reconstruction is many Americans are like, why are we occupying the South with our army when that army could be out west fighting Native Americans? So it just is another blow to Reconstruction. The final piece of the ending of Reconstruction is the election of 1876. So you have the Democrat running a guy named Samuel Tilden, and the Republican running Rutherford B. Hayes. Now you can see the election, it's a dead heat, super close. It's hard to tell who actually won. Now in 3 states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, these were still controlled by Republican governments. So when the vote comes back looking very close during the election, Hayes' supporters, Hayes' administration sends news and message to these 3 states saying, make sure those ballots come back in favor of Hayes. So basically he's telling them informally to cheat, to stuff the ballot box. News gets out, the Democrats find out about this, 2 sets of results come back from each of these 3 states, and it very much looks like the Republicans cheated. As a result, the Democrats are going to say Tilden won, and if you don't give him the election, there's going to be another fight. So we get the compromise of 1877 to prevent another kind of rebellion, another mini civil war. So the Southerners, the Democrats, agree to the following. They will admit Hayes won the presidency. They will accept Republican amendments, so those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And they'll refrain from partisan attacks against Republicans in the South. In exchange for these 3 concessions, the Northerners, the Republicans, have to agree to the following. To remove the last federal troops from the South, include a Southerner in Hayes' cabinet, and give political concessions and control over patronage. So basically, conservatives, primarily Democrats, have to receive good positions in governmental offices. So this pretty much ends Reconstruction. Slowly, all of these states are brought back in. You can kind of see the dates in which these states were brought back in and fully redeemed. So this election of 1876 with the following compromise of 1877 was the final nail in the coffin of Reconstruction. Now most historians conclude that Reconstruction was never completed because the South basically goes back to a very similar system to what it had been before, with the new Jim Crow system being established shortly after the end of Reconstruction. So we'll stop there for today. And this is pretty much one of the last lectures.